Is that how Coachmate came about?
Sports volunteers are probably the biggest group of volunteers in the world, and they have nothing. It's crickets. But I was like, let's have a little look at this. How could we take our storytelling skills and translate these terrible PDFs into something that a parent could deliver? And I was like, holy cow, I reckon I could coach off that.
Have you had anyone tell you to your face that they won't back you because you're a female?
I actually didn't think there were too many barriers for women. And then I got into tech. That money is funding generally 30-year-old dudes to solve 30-year-old dude problems is so terrifying. And when I did Richie McCaw's feature film, there's a story, there's a historic story, but that could have been told 10 years later.
If I was going to make a documentary, how the hell do you even start?
You just ask the questions that you want to know, or you just quietly observe. The number one thing to make a great documentary is access to a story.
How's it been getting into tech from a different industry? Have you found it easier, challenging?
I think the biggest barrier is...
Hey everyone, Troy Hammond here, and that means you're back with us or here for the first time, maybe, on the We Fucking Love Startups podcast. Today, if you're watching this on video, you're going to see a lot of smiles from me because I get to discuss some of my favorite topics: documentaries, filmmaking, agencies, and tech startups with Michelle Walshe, who is just an absolute awesome human being. We discuss her director story. She directed documentaries like the Richie McCaw documentary, the Brooklyn Nets, Serena Williams, she's done some phenomenal things. And now she is making it easy for coaches at grassroots level to equip themselves with the skills and knowledge that they need to be successful. So you're going to love this episode. Strap in and enjoy.
Kia ora. Thanks for tuning in to the We Fucking Love Startups podcast, brought to you by Talent Army.
Jono and I are making a documentary apparently now, right?
Yeah.
So we're, because I have all the time in the world,
I can tell that.
I'm just going to jump into something new because I kept an ADHD here.
Yeah.
How the hell do you even start? Like, how many people do you need?
Documentary.
Yeah. If I was going to make a documentary...
That's a huge question. That's like, how do you start a business?
What is the skeleton crew that I would need?
I'd go back a step and I'd say, with documentary, the number one thing to make a great documentary is access to a story that people want to hear.
Yeah.
Like, your access to something is everything. Because you can make a documentary that's verite and it's shot, it's a bit ropey, or you can make something beautiful like we talked about, Chef's Table.
Yeah.
So with something like Chef's Table or a big BBC doc, you're going to have like these massive crews and big budgets and time. But you can also make something incredibly exhilarating that's, small crew. When we recently worked on a project in New York for the Brooklyn Nets, the project I can't talk about, but I will somehow. That was often one person in a room because the content was so sensitive. And the most important thing was that the influence of the crew didn't impact what we were filming. And so in that instance, you make sacrifices on video quality, sound quality, like lighting quality, because the content is so important.
Yeah.
So I think I would say horses for courses, Like if you've got time to make something beautiful, for sure, but really it's all about content. You can get away with murder if you have good audio.
Yeah.
You can never get away with bad audio, really, but AI is fixing that now.
Yeah, no, it's crazy.
So, and then you're like, okay, where is it playing? Do I need to bring in a broadcast partner first?
What about storyline?
Interesting.
How do you, to break it down for me, if you were making a documentary about oxygen advisors here, right?
Yeah.
How would you unearth the true story that you're looking to film?
I think just be super curious. So start number one.
And you as the director unearthing that story?
Yeah, like good documentaries I think are made by very curious people that just want to understand something about humanity, or a character study. Or they are deeply and inherently curious, and that's where your storyline will generally come from, because you are looking for a learning or an insight. And when I did Richie McCaw's feature film, obviously that was like, there's a story, there's a historic story, but that could have been told 10 years later. And I think personally I love follow docs where you're You don't know the outcome. And when you watch the doco back, you realize the subjects didn't know the outcome either at the time. So that's pretty powerful. But again, if you don't know where that story's going, but inherently like the person or their journey is really interesting and you're really deeply curious, you just ask the questions that you want to know, or you just quietly observe, and the story will unfold itself. I think if you're doing a doco that's historical, it's very different.
I love that you say doco like an Aussie, by the way.
Shh, don't blow my cover. After I did Richie McCaw's doco, his manager, like, the penny dropped that I was Australian. And he's like, let's not
Your
talk about
accent's
that.
slightly there, but not so much anymore.
Mostly Aussies can pick it up.
Yeah, mine. People have no idea with my accent anymore because it slides in and out depending on how drunk I am.
I think it's because you're Australian. I'm letting a little bit of it come out, but I'm actually super careful because it's a bit like being an American in Canada.
Yeah.
Like you just need to keep that to yourself.
I think I changed my accents more because I got so sick of answering the same question.
You just said answering.
Yeah,
said like a true Kiwi.
What are you doing here? What are you doing on this side of the the ditch? And so
I think I just like to assimilate. Well, like when I'm around Americans, I grew up partly in Canada, so like it's embarrassing how quickly I can roll my R's again. I think again, it's like I love connecting with people and I'm deeply curious about them. And if I can take away the sense that I'm an other, I feel like you can connect quicker. So as soon as I land in Australia, it's so embarrassing. My family and any Kiwis that are around me just like, what just happened to you? Yeah. And it's like, oh, mate. No, not quite.
My team take the piss out of me all the time because I was like organising a trip home the other week. And I was talking about, I'm going to book a trip. And I was talking to my brother and I was like, and we'll go to Ballina and we'll go to... and they're like, Ballina? What the...
Yeah, Ballina. Is that a real place? Oh, Ballina, mate. So I'm excited about your doco.
Well, yeah. So am I, and the 300 other things I'm going to do this year. But I think that'll be fun.
I'd say start shooting, because if it's a follow doc, obviously you want to think about like some structure for sure. But if something's happening and you're deeply curious about it, just start shooting and then you'll figure it out, because it's a long journey.
Yeah.
Well, often docos are a really long journey. I mean, the Richie McCaw film, I remember saying to him, well, actually, it's my dear, beautiful husband, Leon, had the courage to ask him to make a doco about his career before he'd said he retired. And at the time it was really sensitive. We're like, hey, you know how you're not going to play forever?
Yeah.
Could we start following you? And I now know that he actually plucked up the courage and said, hey, Michelle wants to ask you if she can make a doco about you. We'd done some advertising work with him. And at the time we just said, I don't even know what this is. I don't know how we're funding it. Somebody's going to really want to do it. Let's just start shooting. And we actually got on a plane and we flew to the Millennium Stadium in Wales for his 100th test. And I remember just going, okay, again, back to access. Where can we have access to you? And he was like, oh, I can probably meet you guys at like 8:00 or something. So I was like, well, why don't we just go around the Millennium Stadium and just see what happens? And we're walking down. It's this like really rainy sort of night, and there were tons of reflections and lights, and it was just like this beautiful, cinematically, such a beautiful environment. And we were walking around the side of the stadium, and he got to the turnstiles and he goes, I've never walked through there before. I've never been a punter. Is that what it feels like? And in that moment I was like, okay, I'm in, we've got to make this. So doco is, it's just observation and curiosity, and then the story will unfold, and trust. Crazy levels of trust.
How do you earn someone's trust? Because they're telling you parts of their story that they probably don't even tell other people, right? And then they're unfolding on camera. Yeah,
it's a beautiful feeling. I haven't reached the high ever in any other pursuit or career, from startup to running a company to directing drama. I've never felt the high that I've felt when somebody opens up in a documentary situation, because you switch off. It's a beautiful thing. You switch off the part of your brain that, as I'm a talker, like obviously, you switch off the part of your brain that wants to respond, and it's almost meditative. You just like soaking in the words and holding these questions and wanting to know why, and then something just happens when they start talking, they open up, and you realize that they're allowing you to hear these innermost things. It's wild. Your whole body just feels electric. But you've got to keep a really straight face and just be like, mm-hmm. And inside you, I've had many times where my eyes have just been completely watering from the emotion of hearing somebody, not necessarily even what they're saying, but that that they're trusting you. So it's like it's the best thing ever.
I can only imagine. Like even podcasting, right? You see that moment where people have all these notes and pre-planned things ready to go, and they're like, leaning back in their chair, and they're a little bit nervous, not looking at you, and then all of a sudden you just see them relax and lean forward and give you their body and the energy, and you're like, they're trusting me now with this conversation, and just that little nugget for me is just so much joy, and so
it's exactly what you're doing already. It's just an extra amount of time. And like imagine if you had to keep showing up to the same person, and then just you're like, I've got a little bit. I had this. It backfired on me on the media, but I still stand by it. When I did Richie's doc, I said, when you ask for an inch, you take 3/4 of one. And I remember somebody, well, clearly the film felt like that. But I completely stand by that, because if you take an inch and a bit, they'll caution, you'll just put a seed of doubt in their mind. And so like it's hard, because sometimes you want to just dive in and be like, what happened, and instead you're just like, okay, I'll just leave that, I'll just come back again.
What about when you're pulling at string and something comes up and you can't tell that story? Do you is there moments where you get something and you're like, and you have to edit it out, and it's it's such a big moment, but you feel good about not outing whatever it may be? Or
I guess there's always a balance. Hey, the trust that you earned feels incredibly precious. I used to make, it's a bit of an embarrassing story really, but I used to make reality TV when I first started learning how to direct. I actually was very lucky. I got to learn the art of directing at Touchdown. And Greenstone and some of those, amazing production companies at the time. They were doing some pretty progressive things. And I remember moving into reality TV, and at the time it was a pretty new format. And I think I was heavily pregnant at the time, so I was post-directing a show. I was post-directing a few shows. And we'd sort of set up these characters. We're like, she's this and he's this, and, their role. And I remember thinking at the time, well, if they said it, knowing that it was kind of out of context, but we were making entertainment. And so I remember, painting somebody as probably not their whole true self, just part of themselves that wasn't, probably how they wanted to be reflected. And they absolutely said that, but there wasn't the broader context. And I didn't know them. I hadn't been on set. And after it went to air, a couple months later, I turned up at daycare. And this woman came around the corner, and the woman who owned the daycare was like, oh, Michelle, I want you to meet this person. She's like, lovely mum with a new kid. And I saw her and my stomach just dropped. And I was like, oh. And of course she had no idea who I was. And she was so lovely. And it was such the biggest line in the sand. I was like, I will never make something that I can't sit in the room with the person who's in it and watch it with them at the same time for the first time. I will never do it. And I never did it again. I moved to Greenstone and started making really wholesome shows like The Zoo about, animal conservation and stuff. But it's good, it's good to have those lessons, right? To feel the sting of that. And I don't think it was detrimental to her life in any way, but I knew that I did something that had crossed a values line for me. I
feel that a lot of people, if there's something political happening in the tech sector, they go, you have to get this person on and talk about that. And I'm like, I don't care to be not investigative journalist or whatever it may be. I want to just have cool, fun, interesting conversations with people. And I would never, I don't know if I'd be able to edit.
It does hurt. There's an expression I've heard people use, which I don't really like, which is it's like, oh, you have to kill your babies. It's a horrible expression. What they mean is the things that you so deeply care about in your doc that are such a part of you, and we're creative people, right? We're so invested, and for one reason or another, from a duration perspective, or sometimes just from a storyline perspective, you just can't go off on that tangent. Because it's not, in doc, you're constantly asking, especially these huge follow docs where you have hundreds of hours of footage, every scene you come to, you're like, is this progressing the story or our character study? What is this? How is this moving us forward? So there's lots of times you have to, or again, to your point, where from their perspective, it's something that was too personal, or you know, they no longer want to share, and you get used to that feeling. You never forget those scenes, like. But I've come to peace with them because it's like, I know that exists.
Yeah,
and
I saw
special.
the behind the scenes cut.
Yeah, I know that. That's why people have director's cuts, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to let go of that stuff. But
What's the documentary that's moved you the most?
oh, such a good question. Oh, I've got favourite docs that like blew my mind when I watched them. Like Icarus is a good one.
Oh,
Isn't
Icarus
that
for me
great?
is like on a pedestal.
It
right?
is. It's phenomenal.
Because it's just like this.
Yeah,
You know,
and
like,
it's a classic follow doc that
Yeah.
just takes you on this crazy journey. I loved doc series like The Jinx. I don't know if you ever watched that one.
No.
That's a really interesting story about a guy called Robert Durst who literally gets away with murder and then
oh, The American in New York. Yes, I've seen it.
Yeah,
it's fantastic.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that's a great doc. In terms of docs that really move me, some of the environmental docs, but sometimes they move you in a way that's, you know, super hard, and that's
Yeah.
okay too.
Mm.
I want to tell stories now that impact people and planet for good, and that can be through inspiration or like literally making people see a different perspective that somehow shifts the way they see the world. That's my MO for everything I do now. And I don't know whether that's just getting to an age where you're like, what is this all for again? Like you can either work super, super hard and build a business, or you can work super, super hard and build a business and do good.
Yeah.
And I'll take the latter every time.
I kind of feel like if you wanted to keep pursuing that, you would still be in New York, right? Like you would be, you don't move to New Zealand to get super successful and rich and famous and all those things. So it does ground you in a little bit to want to contribute something good to the country and the world. And so that's my interpretation. Like I feel.
Is that why you're here?
It's probably why I stay here because of my kids. But what I love about New Zealand is that it's an emotional country because you know people and you run into people at the daycare, or if I talk shit about someone on the podcast, I'd probably see them tomorrow. Like it's just, and so I inherently feel more connected to everyone here in New Zealand, and so I do this podcast because I want to help people. Like I always say, for me, New York, Australia, the UK, like no one wanted to share the information. Everyone was out to get, they were like, screw you, like I want to beat you. And then New Zealand, I feel like we're a little bit more forthcoming, but we're just not very good at telling the story ourselves. People are so worried about tall poppy here that, they don't want to stand up and say, this is what I've done. And so, I think I answered your question in a really long way there. But anyway, getting back to me directing now again. How did you get into like filmmaking in the first place?
I always loved documentary. I studied, I went to London. Actually, I started my career in magazine publishing actually in Sydney. And I was working for fashion magazines. That's just where I fell into, I think. I left school. I didn't finish high school. I think I was probably classic ADHD, undiagnosed, but just, that I had things to do. And I felt like the teachers didn't want to be there and I didn't want to be there either. And so I left school and I went and got a job as a receptionist at a place called Murdoch Magazines. I wouldn't work for the Murdochs now, just note. But at the time, I got a job as a receptionist, and I remember spending my holidays going around all the different departments of the magazines and learning about marketing and design and all that kind of stuff. And so I sort of went down the publishing route, but documentary was always something that I gravitated to even as a kid. And even now, if I get on a plane, I go straight to the documentary section. It annoys me. It's always at the very bottom.
Yeah.
Get it up the top. So I'm just, again, deeply curious about people, and I will always take a real life non-fiction story over fiction. So when I did my OE and I went to London and I found a course, it was like a weekend course at the Chelsea College of Arts in documentary production. I think it's on my LinkedIn profile and probably sounds better than it was because it was really low key. But in the education section, I fall quite short in LinkedIn.
Yeah. Same. I left school at 15. So
Classic.
Yeah.
Classic. And so, I was always super, super interested in documentary. And I met my wonderful life partner, Leona, over in London. And he was working for a place that did sound sync, synced up clapper boards and DAT tapes back in the day. They did a lot of BBC documentaries would come in. And I convinced him it was a great idea to give me a job too. And so that was my first sort of soiree, I guess, into real television and filmmaking. When we left London, due to unforeseen circumstances, I got pregnant. We came back, and the first job that was available literally in the newspaper was for an editor and cameraman in Rotorua.
How did you get convinced to come back to New Zealand as a pregnant Aussie lady? Because I was like, I just did what I was told, like I was like, hey, we're moving to New Zealand. I was like, okay.
You had the same situation, right?
Yeah.
You got someone was pregnant and you had to move somewhere.
Yeah.
I relate. I think we met back up here in New Zealand because we were in different places at the time. That's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
But we met back up at Auckland Airport. And we had £700 to our name and no jobs. So I think that it was literally the first job that we found in a newspaper that said cameraman and editor. And my husband Leon applied for it. And it was a needs must. Like we literally just were like, okay, we're off to Rotorua. And I had been to New Zealand once. I certainly didn't know that the odour that was going to come with living there whilst being, having morning sickness. It was quite an adjustment. But what it did actually, like starting out in small town gave us these incredible opportunities because all we had to say was we worked with the BBC and people were like, oh, you should direct this. Yeah. And that's literally what happened. We were working for a little production company down there and they said, oh, you know things about television. And I was like, yes,
you should see my LinkedIn education.
I went to the Chelsea College of Arts for a documentary production. And they literally said, well, can you interview these kids? And we were doing this, a really cool project for Work and Income about kids that were who had some tough starts in life and had found education and had, were doing some really neat stuff. And so I did some sort of research. And they were like, we can't get a director in Rotorua. You've already interviewed them. Would you actually direct it? And talk about imposter syndrome. Holy heck. Like I'd never seen a director. I mean, I'd only, literally in the BBC thing, I'd only heard them occasionally in the back of a DAT tape. And so that was the start of it. And then we eventually moved to Auckland and Julie Christie gave me a job again because it looked like I'd done some stuff. And I remember she said, for those of you that don't know her, she's was probably a massive influence here in TV formats, most certainly. And she said, I'm going to get, I think it was like 24, 25, you're going to be the tips director on Changing Rooms. And Changing Rooms, I don't know if anyone remembers that show. It was like where people did up their neighbour's lounge room, like with the smell of a bad idea.
Scariest thing of my life. If you were like, oh, I'm just going to do your lounge, I'm like, no, you're fucking not.
Yeah, they literally like, oh, I think he likes music, and you'd come home and you'd have like treble clefs on your wall. It was terrible. We even used masking tape instead of paint when we ran out of time. But she said, you're gonna do this job, and I remember back then, I had no idea how to direct. I'd certainly never seen a female director. My only references were like George Lucas, Steven Spielberg. I was like, okay, I'm just going to have to be really loud and like try looking up books. I don't think the internet. I don't even think I could Google it. There wasn't. Of course, I couldn't. And so I remember turning up on set that day, and I was like, I didn't sleep a wink. Like, not people go, you didn't sleep. Like I just lay there all night thinking I'm going to be found out. And there was this professional crew, and I turned up and everyone knew what they were doing. And it came to my part to direct these tips of like how to turn an apple box into a lampshade or something. And I was like, okay, I've got to be loud. And I was like, okay, everyone, I yelled to the catering truck, we're going to do a wide shot, and all these camera people, men, just looked horrified. I mean, I think everybody just was like, and I knew something was pretty wrong. But I got fired off that job within a day, I think. And then I spent a year researching and learning how to direct before they let me back out again. But, you know, back then it was just like talk about fake it till you make it.
But like, how many people would turn up and do that day? Like, how many people do you think would fall out before that?
Well,
that
I mean,
day started?
how could you? Like,
but most people wouldn't ever do it. Like, most people wouldn't put themselves in that position where they'd be like just absolutely shitting themselves that they just wouldn't be able to do it. And I think there's only a select group of people that just say, oh, if that's my comfort zone, I'm just going to push myself out of it and go for it. And so
it still makes me feel sick.
Yeah.
So like it was
Isn't it funny how those are the most vivid memories of our lives?
It's very formative. Being unprepared.
Yelling the food truck.
But I think back then, you know, I recently did a talk as my first keynote speech, which was also so scary. I don't really like putting myself out there. I'm learning to do it more and more. But I had to do this keynote speech, and I did it at St Andrews in Scotland recently to a room of 100 female leaders, and I was like,
and that's your first one?
Yeah. It was this amazing process because I had to go back and reflect on my whole career, and I called it Sorry, Not Sorry, my journey to unapologetic leadership as a female. And I went back and realised through so much of my career, like from when I directed to when we started an ad agency, to when then I was directing big sets in very male-dominated environments, to starting a tech company, to trying to raise money. Like all of these things I'd never seen anybody do. And when I did think about them, I only had males to reference in my mind. Not to say there weren't great women doing it, but in my mind I was like, right, how do I be the leader of an ad agency? I've never worked in an ad agency. Okay, well, I'm going to have to be decisive and be really clear, and I'm going to have to be really confident and like look like I've got a bit of an ego.
Yeah.
You know, and they're kind of these, I'm not saying all males are like that, but they're very sort of male ideas of just have an answer, talk first. And it took me literally until I was like, early 40s to recognise that I brought a whole different thing because I was a female and I didn't have a gap that needed filling. I actually had a whole different lens that had a value. And that's been a really awesome journey to have those epiphanies and have the opportunity to like reflect like that.
I think you do what you see, right? It's as simple as that. And so, and like I've actually been talking about this a lot recently, but I went to Electrify Aotearoa in Wellington. Yeah.
Did I see that?
I would have been walking around. Yeah. And I really regretted not taking my daughter because it was it was so cool to be in a room with people just being unapologetically themselves, right? Sorry, not sorry. They were just like, I'm going after it. And there were some really interesting debates and talks and everything, right? And I was just like, that's what I want for my daughter. I just want her to be able to do whatever the hell she wants to do and not have to worry about, you know, like, is she going to get funding? Is she seeing it? Whatever it may be. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful that that's the future that we're creating now.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I actually didn't think there were too many barriers for women. Now, I thought there was a lot less, and then I got into tech as a female CEO, and then went to fundraise, and I was just like, whoa.
Yeah. Have you had anyone tell you to your face that they won't back you because you're a female?
No. I don't know that.
Janine Granger was on the podcast, and she said that a guy told her to her face, I'm not going to back you because you're female.
Well, there was a conversation at Electrify, you might have heard.
Yeah.
Specifically to that. Oh, I mean, the stats are super sobering. You can read stats that up to 98% of venture capital in the States goes to male-founded companies. The thing that's really disturbing about that, and I was talking to somebody else about this. It certainly isn't my original thinking by any means, but the idea that money is funding generally 30-year-old dudes to solve 30-year-old dude problems is so terrifying for humanity and society. Yeah. It's such a loss. I think about like the type of tech that's out there, and it, of course, a lot of it solves problems for females too, but you think about fintech, travel tech, sports tech, edutech, they very much serve a male audience, and there's not a lot of tech out there to help run a household or bridge equality, or in the instance of Coachmate, you know, there's not really anyone sitting going, how does this help a volunteer or a mum who's running a family? I feel really strongly about that diverse viewpoint now. I think in the past, perhaps I would have gone, you know, how much is funding female ideas really going to change the products that evolve or are given the fuel to grow? And now I absolutely believe that.
Yeah.
Like, I nearly stepped down from Coachmate as the CEO because we couldn't raise money, and I thought being female was the reason.
So being in tech is way more chauvinist than film industry?
Interestingly, documentary, and it's probably no surprise, it has a lot of females because, again, it's like there's sort of a level of empathy that's required in doc, and maybe that naturally skews towards women. Again, I really don't like broadly generalising, but there's a lot of women in documentary. I found it was harder to, you know, I remember being in very male-dominated environments and feeling a bit of fish out of water, spent a lot of time in working with the All Blacks, for example, and sometimes you turn around and you're like, oh, I'm it. So maybe I should talk about sport, you know.
Yeah. Is that how Coachmate came about, just from like your interest in sport, or was it a problem that you saw?
Coachmate's such an interesting story. When you're in the thick of it and you're going a million miles an hour, you don't get to reflect too much. So probably I'll have some reflections whilst doing this now, talking it.
This is where you get to craft your origin story though, right? Like everyone in tech, because like the longer you go, the more you get to just reflect and change that story a little bit. Yeah.
Coachmate just came at this time. So we accidentally created an ad agency. So my husband and I branched out and we started Augusto in 2008. And that was really interesting because we didn't know at the time what we were doing, but we'd had these diverse sets of experiences in different fields and came to starting a business without any experience in the business that we were creating. So Leon had come from being a cameraman and editor and working in interactive, and I'd come from TV. And we saw this sort of, phones were looking like they were about to play video. We launched the same month as Vimeo, actually. And content wasn't a word yet, but there was people who made TV shows, there were people who made ads, there were people who made films, and there were people who did corporate video and they burnt it to DVDs. Like that was all, and they didn't really mix that much. And I remember seeing the budgets for advertising and thinking, I can make a whole TV show for like that 30 second. I can make 6 half hours for that. And what if we, you know, as more people want to tell their stories, we've got a background in storytelling. What if we took the economic model, the business model, if you like, the financial model of making TV, where we can make half an hour for 50 grand, and we take the same people and we apply it to advertising for this longer form storytelling? Because back then I remember ad agencies were really grappling with how do we tell a 2-minute story, because you can't multiply the budget by 4. It's already expensive. And of course now we're just like, oh, it's content, but it was a really unusual time. And so we were accidentally sort of creating a company in a discipline or a segment of the market that we didn't understand. We didn't understand advertising at all. But we knew that people needed stories, and there was a cheaper way to do it with really good people, and that became Augusto. And Augusto, you know, now I'm still incredibly proud of Augusto. It is much more of an ad agency now than we ever thought it could be. You know, it still does now the brand campaigns for Adidas globally for sustainability and rugby. We just did Olympics and outdoor. It's an amazing group of people. But, you know, story was always at the core. But that came about because of this idea of people coming from diverse disciplines and disrupting in an industry that they just don't know enough to know the barriers. Like now I think I'd find it a lot harder to innovate in advertising because I know the barriers.
Yeah. That's the cool thing about starting something before the industry's created, right? Or the segment's created, is you're just figuring it out as you go.
It's tricky because you don't always know how to price it and how to sell it.
Yeah.
But I I feel really strongly now, and we get to see it in startups all the time. If you think about all the great startups and you go back and look at the founding team, there's a really high probability that the industry they disrupted, they didn't come from. Like the chart, I actually don't know the background to some of the big ones like Airbnb, but I bet the founder didn't come from running hotels.
No, interesting story. You should listen to a podcast on him. It's a really fascinating story. He set up Airbnb because there was a conference in San Francisco and there was no hotels, and he was like, well, why don't we just buy an airbed and put a room in our spare room? And then they did it, and then he was like, that was easy, why don't we do more? And and
that was that. So that's the cool thing is about startups is they allow you to disrupt and innovate in industries that you know nothing about, but you feel the problem personally in some way often.
What was the problem you felt with sports?
Coachmate. Such a good, I love this story. Maybe I have to love it because I get up and I'm so passionate about this. But I guess you asked me that, didn't you? And we're getting there. So Augusto had been going for maybe 10 years. And during that time, we had a lot of experiences where we were the agency for big brands like AIG or Adidas that we were helping them leverage their partnerships around the world. And I remember them having a lot of trouble getting to grassroots sports. You just can't show up there. You've got the choice of being in an EDM with a special offer or something to a database. Maybe you can put hoardings up. But generally speaking, the grassroots community is extremely hard to access. And that's because where do you find them?
Yeah.
That you hope they open an email or they're on WhatsApp. But they're everywhere, and they're in our communities all day, every day, doing great things with kids. Or at least for themselves, playing sport. So I knew that was a challenge. I also had 4 kids, and I'd really felt in a very deep, heartfelt way the disparity in their experiences in sport, depending on the coach that was lovely enough to volunteer their time.
Yeah.
And I knew that all coaches had really, really good intentions. Like most people, you don't really coach unless you want to give back to the community or your kid or whatever. But I remember thinking my husband, Paul Leon, was the only person available on a Tuesday to take the under-9s football, team at Western Springs. And I remember watching it was like a rainy night on the side of Walker Park in Point Chev in Auckland. And there were 2 teams, they were the same age group, and they were both having incredibly different experiences in their training. And that was because one team had a bunch of dads primarily that had played football, knew each other, knew how to literally play the game. And our kids, and there was a whole bunch of kids with creative parents who hadn't really had a lot to do with sport but knew that it was good for our kids. And the kids were doing angel, what are those star in the mud? Snow angels in mud, and they're running around, and it was chaos. And I remember just standing there being like, wow, the future of sport is in grassroots, and this is just left to chance. And my son Jarvis ended up being incredibly passionate about football, and we ended up paying a lot of money in additional coaching. And finally, he found his way into those teams, and he had coaches that knew what they were doing, and he was able to eventually sort of get there. But I watched that happen in real time over this. He's now 19, so over 10 years, and so that was a really weird. I just kept thinking about being like, how is this so left to chance? It seems like a really important thing that society values. And all this money's in I knew because I was working in that area, all the money's up in the top tier, all the advertising revenue's there, the high performance is there, the resources, the coaching, everything is there. But the chance of your kid getting there is completely left to chance. And these poor volunteers are coming from work. And so full credit to all the volunteers out there. It's taking...
I took over my son's football team because no one else could do it. And I've never played football, never trained football, soccer, in my life. Yeah. I'm, as I said, I'm a mad AFL guy, right?
Yeah.
And then so they were like, well, if someone doesn't step up, we're going to have to forfeit the team this year. And I was like, all right, well, I'll do it. But I have no idea. And I went out asking everyone I know. I was like, where do I find resource? How do I learn? What do I do? And everyone was like, I don't know, and so I was just watching YouTube videos at night going,
right.
What does a football coach do?
Crazy. Yeah. But this is happening 1,000 times a day across every sport, across every country. one of the biggest widespread problems. And in fact, I've estimated, I don't know if this is true, I should probably fact check it, that sports volunteers are probably the biggest group of volunteers in the world as well. And they have nothing. It's crickets.
Yeah.
And if there is something, it's on a website that you can't find. So I was very, very lucky that in, I think, 2017, my co-founder Lee Kenyon walked in the door of Augusto, and I knew of, not Lee, but I knew of his football program. He ran a really great academy, Onehunga Sports and Football Club, and I knew when our teams faced their teams, the kids were really good and they were very respectful kids, and I knew a little bit about what he did. And he came in, he had his own football methodology, and he felt the same. He wanted to give access to more people so that it was easier to give kids good sports experiences. He's very values-based as well. And he's like, it doesn't feel fair that kids that aren't the elite kids who absolutely deserve as good an experience are really just, again, left to chance. And I remember him coming in and one of the team, Brad, who was a friend, was like, what do you think we do with this? And I was like, this is really interesting. Let's just I think we made him pay for it, pay for a video. But I was like, let's just do what it costs. Let's just have a little look at this. I'm really interested in this. What could we do? How could we take our storytelling skills and translate these terrible PDFs into something that a parent could understand and deliver? And I remember seeing these beautiful animated videos that were 90 seconds the team came up with. And I was like, holy cow, I reckon I could coach off that. And I've never had the confidence. I'm like, I'll be team manager. Women are even less likely to coach than guys. Lee and I sat together and we started looking at the problem, and I was like, I think this is bigger than football, and I think it's bigger than New Zealand. And, we both started looking into more research, and we found that kids leave sport at 5 times the rate under an unskilled coach, and that this was a global problem. And we just sat there and we thought, surely, we can't be the ones figuring out that this is a problem. There's got to be stuff. What exists out there? And the more we looked, the more we found it was completely inadequate. And I think he'd come from high performance sport and academies. He's a professional footballer. He knew the services that elite people got, and he wanted everybody to have that. I'd come from advertising, and I knew that sponsors had a problem getting to grassroots. I'd come as a parent, and I knew that the experiences when our kids had an amazing coach were life-changing. And the alternative, in some instances where a coach feels like their job is just to win, can make kids feel really like they don't belong if they're not the best kid on the field. And in America has a whole culture of you're good or you're benched.
Yeah.
Participation
as Australia is pretty similar,
can be, right? But
Jono and I were talking about this, and one thing he said he loves about your platform is he was like, there was like a little reminder to say, I really enjoyed watching you play today or something. And he was like, it's just little touches like that's so good, because your kid just thinks about that for the rest of the day. They don't feel like they had to win or lose. They don't feel like they had to be the best player or the worst player. Yeah. But just for their parents to say, I really enjoyed you watching you play today.
But we don't think to do that as parents, because it's a white space. There's no information for parents of how to be even necessarily great parents, to be fair. Where do you search stuff to be a good parent? That's my next step.
Yeah.
But there's no information about what to say in the car ride home. So it's really interesting. We looked at the problem and we thought, well, who cares about this? And I'm like, well, government cares. This is about well-being. Kids who stay in sport. This is fascinating to me too. I just thought, it's good for your kids to play, but I didn't know that kids who stay in sport have better life outcomes, less depression, less anxiety, better test scores, more likely to go to uni, less drug use, less just teen pregnancy. It goes on and on, right? So government cares, the sport cares. That's retention. It's their future fans. Somebody who engages with a sport when they're young has something like 47 times the lifetime value to a sport, which makes sense, right? So if you have a bad experience, you're not buying tickets as an adult. Sponsors care because a lot of their consumers are sitting in grassroots household shoppers. The parents care because they want their kid to feel like they belong. And, I don't know that there's anywhere that parents specifically feel more passionate than on the sidelines of their kids' sport on a Saturday. So there's a lot of investment, and yet nobody's looking after this group of people. So we looked at Coachmate and we're like, okay, so I think that nobody should pay for this. Sport already has to be accessible. when I say nobody, somebody has to pay, but not the end user.
Yeah.
The parents and volunteers who are already giving so much, they shouldn't have to pay. The kids should all get great experiences. So what is the business model then? Who's going to pay for this? And so we just looked at the problem from a completely different perspective, and we put the kid in the center. I'm like, okay, well, if our mission is to keep kids in sport and make them all feel like they belong and they have a place in sport, then what does that look like? Because yes, obviously we have to upskill the coach, but there's a lot more going on around. And the first iteration of Coachmate was for coaches only. And then we're like, well, actually, if a coach does an amazing job and then the kid on the way home doesn't really feel great about themselves, well, how could we help parents have tools? Because I certainly was that parent being like, so why did you run up the left line in the second half? I didn't know that wasn't my job. I didn't know that actually my job was just to want to make them play next year. I think we all forget that because it's like we're competitive people. We just, and then we're like, okay, well, the national sports body really cares. Can we give them data that they've never had in grassroots? Can we get the sponsor to pay for it? Because they care, you know. And so it was really interesting when you put a child in the center with a very mission or very purpose-led approach, and you start trying to solve the problem and look at the whole ecosystem of how you can add value, it just creates a different product. That's what's so exciting. And because we never worked in a sport or a national sports body, it never occurred to me about like why that shouldn't be that way. Because I think if you work in a sports body, you're going to think, well, we have to give coaches accreditations and we'll put it on a learning management system because what else is there? And they're doing an amazing job. But it's not for them to think about a tech solution and then try to solve it. And that's the beautiful thing about tech.
Every team I've been on, I coached, and I've been coaching basketball since I was 9. I think I used to coach like 5-year-olds.
Did you?
Yeah, and I've always thrown myself to be a coach. There's always these crappy websites or crappy PDF documents that you get, or most of the time nothing, right? And so it's it's daunting. And I'm still coaching my son's basketball. You know, I try and get parents to the games, try and get like other parents to start coaching, and yeah, it's hard. It's because it's the last thing in my day. Like I'm always rushing to the game at the last minute from work. Yeah. You don't get time to prepare. You don't get time to do these things. And so, but it is, I'm like kids these days spending way more time in front of a screen than ever before. And this is the time that they get out, learn valuable lessons. Mental health, it's so important that they learn resilience.
So important. Sport or having activities outside of the home, outside of their school friend network, so important for these kids. I've seen a big difference in my 2 older kids to my 2 younger kids. I think from the time that COVID happened, and half of the kids don't even seem to go to school. They're really struggling. And when my oldest daughter Helena said, "Oh, I don't want to play sport," I was like, "Okay, like sure, maybe do some acting or like do something else." When my youngest child, Charlie, said, "I don't want to play sport," I was like, "We're going to find a sport."
Yeah, you just haven't found the right one.
Yeah, we're going to work at this now because I have such a different understanding about the value of sport. And I hated team sport as a kid. I had some really bad experiences playing tennis and with coaching. And not that I think that's a motivator for Coachmate at all, but I do know what it feels like to not feel included, or that sport's for me. And I deeply feel that sport's for everyone. And that's what I like. If we could stop the churn of kids, 12, 13, 14-year-old kids, and keep another 10% of kids out there feeling good about their bodies, feeling like they belong, like that's job done for me. That's why I think, that's why I get up every day.
Yeah, if I was to think back about sports, I have some great moments where coaches have just been so lovely, like throughout my life as a sports player. And I've played sport quite competitively, over the years. And I'm curious, like I imagine if I was interviewing Richie McCaw for a documentary, I imagine there'd be some moments where he was like, thinking about a coach or talking about a coach, that may have helped shape him. And so,
big time.
How's it been like getting into tech from a different industry? Have you found it easier, challenging?
I think the biggest barrier is myself in some ways, because I know how to grow and run a company to $10 million company or whatever. Just pick something. And I know how to grow a sustainable company that's a service business.
Yeah.
So my default is like, and this was really hard with VCs. It's like, if you get, and thank gosh I was told this early, careful where you take money from, because if you take money from a VC that wants a 10 times multiplier in this period of time and you're not going to hit those markers, you'll be cut off like a diseased limb. And I was like, this is a sustainable business. I know how to make a business here. We can do enterprise, 4-year contracts. I know how to run it. I can absolutely set up the systems to run a company like that. But that's a big limiter as well, because this product, most tech and SaaS that's not what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
You're supposed to, and why I was so excited about Coachmate is because making Richie's doco or working in a service business there, there's only so much impact you can create. Like the doco was the highest grossing doc of all time, and it still had a shelf life of a couple of years, and maybe the odd person sees it on the plane. Augusto, amazing team, but we create campaigns and it's the next one. So the exciting thing about Coachmate was that we could create a behavioural change and social impact on a scale that could never be possible in those other businesses. But my default as a CEO is to do what I know, which is grow a sustainable business. And Coachmate absolutely is doing that. So my challenge was like, okay, I need to put people around me that understand how to scale a business, because that's not my default. And I'm an older founder, really. Like, I'm not 25. Can you tell?
Yeah.
So that's been awesome and a challenge.
Yeah. For I was like, there's no right or wrong way to answer that as a guy, but definitely not. definitely don't look your age. I couldn't believe I almost dropped my class when you said you had a 21-year-old. But
23, but who's
23. When
No.
So to like dig into that a little bit more, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, you've got Mikey, one of my favorite people in the world, working for you.
He's amazing. He was so important. So he's another co-founder. He came on board, and thank God for Mikey.
Yeah. I worked with him at Vend ages ago. Lovely guy.
Oh, so talented, but yeah.
Yeah. And so do you still manage both, or are you all in on Coachmate
I'm all
now?
in on I started all in on Coachmate this year.
Awesome.
Actually, the end of last year we raised money and I went all in, and I got, like we didn't raise until April. So we went for years on the smell of an oily rag, with a massive advantage that we had a big advertising agency that I could sneak like work into. And a lot of people that were really invested and excited about what we were building in Augusto. And all of that sports knowledge and some good sports connect. So it's not like we bootstrapped with no support. We had enormous support from having that foundation, which is super cool, but it took us a long time to raise. And in the end, we found amazing partners in Australia, XV Capital, who completely understand the problem. Sterling Mortlock and James Godfrey, they come from sport and they deeply understand the grassroots problem, and we're so excited that we were trying to solve it. And so when we found them, I was just like, yes, they're out there. It just takes a while to find. And they didn't. I think they thought it was probably a bonus that I was a female, to be honest. I have to ask them. They really appreciated my background in film and advertising, because we brought this sort of world-class quality to all the content, and we could manage sponsor relationships and things like that. But they've just been amazing, and they just light up went about the problem and how we're trying to solve it.
I think, I mean, I remember when Dan first started told me about Coachmate and you guys, and there's like, like we deal with a lot of tech startups, and you hear a lot of like, hey, they're building this and they're going to solve the world by this, and there's not many of them that are really solving a world problem, right? Like I shouldn't say that, that's a horrible thing to say, but like that's not that absolute purpose-driven humanity problem as well. And so it's like really exciting when people are doing something that has the ability to change generation of people, and I think that's what this is doing, like with your kids. Like I grew up, my dad was terrible sports father, right? Like I remember like playing the game of my life at a grand final in football, and I was like having an asthma attack at halftime, and he came running over and he stood into my guts and he was like, "Get up, you still got another half to go, mate." And it's like shaped my sports, because for me sports was like I went to an anger, in sports, and then I had to unpack all that childhood trauma later in life. But so with my kids now, I'm first and foremost, I'm so proud of them for whatever they do, and I'm just like happy to push them into things and let them go and support them and be there for them. But I feel super passionate about children should do something like this, and they should commit to it, because even if you leave as a teenager, it's going to set your life up, and all these skills that you're going to need for the rest of your life that we're not getting so much anymore, you can get from sports under the right coaches. And so
it's really exciting, isn't it? It's I've been saying this a bit lately. Your why is, you just can't underestimate. Startup is so hard. Like selling an enterprise, it's like a 2-year sales cycle. You imagine you're like, we're going to show this to sports and they're going to love it. And they're like, we love this. And 18 months later, they're like, well, it's going to procurement. Like it can kill you. It feels like there are more barriers than anything I've ever worked in. And I'm totally fine with it, because it just, like, you get these wins where that reaffirm the why. That thing, like every day, it sounds so corny, but nearly every day at Coachmate we talk about our why, which is keeping kids in sport. And it's such an easy one. It's like, we do this to keep kids in sport. Will this product feature help a kid stay in sport? And obviously sometimes you have to broaden that a bit, because you're like, well, if it makes the coach's job easier and the coach feels confident, then of course they're going to give the kid a bit of experience. But it's helped us attract amazing talent. Our dev team, and we've just hired some new people. They literally said one of the main reasons we chose Coachmate is your purpose. Yeah. And we can get up and fight for that every day. We've had customers that have looked at competitor products that are more high performance coaching products, and just said we've sold it off paper because they believed that we were trying to solve the same problem. And all of the decisions that we have to make on a day-to-day basis, if you're really clear on the why, it's so much easier. Yeah. Because there's so many questions. Like, that's the thing about tech, it's so, like, the possibilities are just extraordinary. It's like, should we go to America or the UK? You can't do, in normal service-based businesses, you can't just be like, should we put 10 people on and scale like that overnight, or should we not? Should we test it in this market or go straight to the States? It's you're client dependent, right? You're like, if we get a client over there, we can do it. But but here you just like, you can do anything. And so having that really clear, just like laser focused drive about why you do what you do every day helps just sort of knock back the noise. And then also on the really hard days, and there are really hard days where just things feel like, you sort of having the odd loss, but you feel like you're winning, but it doesn't feel right. There's all these, challenging things in any business. Somewhere, somebody will write to you and say, hey, I just wanted to say thank you so much. This means a lot to our community, or whatever. And you're just like, yes, and it fills your tank up, and off you go again. Yep. And I can't imagine what it would be like being in a tech startup without that. And I know people do. Maybe they're a bit younger and have a lot more energy or something. Yeah. I think they just fake it a lot more. or they tell the story so often about their purpose that they end up believing whatever it turns into. And I think, but and some people are just passionate about different things, right? So like what they would say is their purpose, I might not say is mine. But if you're doing it in a like beautiful, confident way, go for it. Hey, I want to go back to the very, very start of the podcast, where you mentioned Brooklyn and a thing. Can we talk about that? Because I remember hearing about this, and I've always been curious. When you're talking about the project.
So for people that don't know, you moved to Brooklyn.
Yeah, we picked up 4 kids and we moved to Brooklyn. It's so wild.
To film.
We had a client over there. AIG was a client. we were getting more work in the States, and Leon and I just at the time had no ceiling to what we thought was possible. I think we found the ceiling in New York. I found my ceiling of what I'm personally capable of, which is disappointing and good to know that there is one in some ways.
I think a lot of people find it in New York.
Right?
Yeah.
New York asks of you every day how badly you want to be there. So one of the other opportunities we had is we were very, very, very fortunate through our connections through the All Blacks to meet Sean Marks, who is a Kiwi GM of the Brooklyn Nets. And we were given a ticket to go and watch the Nets game. And I'll just declare for full transparency, I know nothing about basketball. I do now because New Zealand basketball's on Coachmate. And I did spend a lot of time following this. But we after the game, he was like, come up to the 8th floor of the head office and come and see the court and come and see what we do. And I remember sitting in his office with Leon, and he had this openness that was so different to anything we'd experienced in New Zealand, particularly in the rugby space where everything is very closed and there's a lot of fear for good reason, but around secrecy. It's a very closed environment. Sean was just so open, and he was like, this is what I'm reading, and this is what I'm thinking, and culture is really important. And I looked at all these different references, but we're the bottom of the table, like the worst team in the league. And I didn't really know what that meant either. But I quickly schooled myself up on the NBA, especially he was like, we said, I think again, Leon had the guts to ask him, said, can we just, I don't know, film you? This feels like pretty interesting, and it feels like back to access, some pretty extraordinary access. And he'd seen Chasing Great, so that helped. And he was like, yeah, we're doing a draft in a week. You want to come and film inside the room? And I was like, I don't know what that is, but I think it's important.
Yeah, very.
I'm so sorry for all the NBA fans out there. But again, I think that naivety is a beautiful thing because
you're curious about the story, because it's developing as in front of you, right?
Yeah, and you ask questions that make the product more broad, because I can, and also you can say, just not take a sports response, a sports journo media response. So if Sean goes, well, blah, 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 I'm like, that doesn't sound like a human response. So tell me what you really feel, and then try again. What do you really feel? And I don't think if I was deeply connected to the NBA or the Brooklyn story or Sean, I may not have had the confidence to just ask questions that maybe he wasn't so used to being asked. But credit to him and the team, they were incredibly open, and he allowed us to film a whole lot of their story for a number of years. We ended up having an office up on the 8th floor.
Wow. But I've never seen it.
No. It's sometimes here's a really hard lesson for you wanting to start out in docs. If you choose to follow a story, it doesn't always work out. It's sometimes forces that are bigger than you come along, and I hope that one day we can tell Sean Marks' story. It's a phenomenal story, and we were there through some pretty historic times, Katie and Kyrie and James Harden. We were in some pretty extraordinary situations, and obviously documenting it for the Brooklyn Nets. And I hope that at one point, there's an opportunity for that story to come out. It is the most amazing NBA story.
I would love it if it came out. That'd be good. I mean, that's how my my Sean and basketball, and a Kiwi being in the NBA. My son got, Brooklyn was his team, and I was like, could have chosen a bit smarter there. They're not so great at the moment, but they were a great team, and so we went and saw them a couple of times in New York.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it?
I hope that story comes out. That'll be cool.
Yeah.
Hey, so we have pretty much come to the end of our episode now, but there is a guest question that we've had from the previous guest. And so the previous question we have is, out of all the people that you've met or interviewed or spoken to in your career, who was the person and what was it about them that really shone
I've definitely met some really, I think when you make a documentary or even in advertising, it's the most privileged situation. You get to meet epically interesting people and they give you their time. And as a director, you get to ask questions that you want to know. And so I've interviewed some amazing people for sure, and worked with some absolute sports legends too. The person that had the most influence on me might surprise you and some of our listeners, and that's Jacinda Ardern. And the reason being is because as a female, I've never seen somebody go into a leadership position as a mother without apology and bring exactly who she was in that moment to her leadership. And I remember working with her through the Labour campaigns or something like that, and seeing her bring a baby into the sort of floors of power, if you like. And there was no, sorry, I hope this is okay. It was just, this is who I am and this is what I bring now. And see the influence of that, I guess, female energy on everyone. And the sort of, it humanized a whole lot of people. There was a real human element to it. And so when I think about all the people that I've spent time with, the person that's influenced me the most would definitely be her, because it allowed me to stop thinking I had a gap to fill in being female in leadership, and actually recognize that some of my traits is from being a mum. Like, I remember not wanting to say I was a mum because I thought, oh, maybe it would make me, like, if people think I'm not as like tough or strong, or that I've got other priorities in my life. And now I'm like, oh my God, that perspective has allowed me to see insights in my business, and as a documentary maker, and now as a startup the CEO of a startup that is very human-centric in its thinking, or child-centric, that it's a massive advantage, and I don't have to apologise for that. So, yeah,
that's good. I like that. Unapologetically used. Sorry, not sorry, right?
Yeah, sorry, not sorry.
I love it. What question would you like to ask the next guest?
Am I allowed to know who the next guest is?
It is Simon Pound, and he'll be here any second, actually. He's probably sitting outside
coming?
now. Yeah.
I love Simon.
Yeah.
I love Simon. That is a great get. Oh my God. He actually interviewed me for Business is Boring.
Did he?
Yes.
Yeah, he's got my favourite podcast voice.
Yeah,
You know, like,
it's the best. You've got a good voice too.
Thank you. Not as good as his, but
my question for Simon is, what makes him so infectiously energetic and enthusiastic about other people's businesses?
Nice.
He's got the most beautiful, infectious energy. And sometimes I look at him and I'm like, oh, that feels tiring. Like, as a documentary, like, you know, sometimes it's hard to find.
Are you like that?
Internally, I think, absolutely, I think he shows it, right? He's like,
Yeah.
and every time I see him, I just, you know, he makes people light up.
Yeah, he's got this crazy smile, right? Yeah, I love the guy. I'm looking forward to it. Hey, but I've loved this. This has been a fantastic chat. I wish we could chat for like
Yeah, I was like,
2
I feel
more
like we
hours.
just started talking. 'Cause I've got a whole lot of questions for you, and that seems unfair.
Until next time, hey? Until next time. Hey, thanks so much for coming on.
So awesome. Thanks.
Cheers. I really enjoyed that episode. I'm a massive fan of Michelle Walshe now. Like, absolute champion of a human being to do the stuff that she has done. Like, it happens to be all my favorite things, like media, documentaries, tech startups, agency, all the thing. Like, ridiculous conversation. I loved it so much. Thank you so much for watching. Jono and I are trying to make a documentary, so I love just learning from Michelle about every moment there. And you're not privy to the extra conversation that I tried to have with her as she was walking out the door, chasing her to ask her more questions. And so we're trying to shoot a documentary. And so if you're watching this on YouTube, let us know in the comments below what we should be doing in that documentary on startups in New Zealand. If not, if you're listening to it on Spotify, if you're listening to it on a podcast platform, jump onto our LinkedIn post where we promote this episode and let us know in the comments who you think we should get on, because we're going to do this thing, right? And we want your support. Do you want it? Do you need it? Do you think it's going to be good? Let us know and tell us and give us your feedback. If you say no, though, I will put a little sad crying face, and just so you know. But thank you so much for watching. This was a real joy, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as me. See you next week.
This podcast is produced by Jono Tucker from Empire Films.